Imagine you're a doctor in the 1960s. You're handing out medical advice and performing surgeries based on nothing more than what your professor told you decades ago, or even worse, just on a hunch. What if I told you that most of what we consider modern medicine didn't actually start relying on rigorous evidence until about 35 years ago? Today we're exploring how a group of medical rebels sparked a revolution that is now transforming everything from how we police our streets to how we run our businesses. Welcome to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one guest at a time. I'm your host, Bob Wells, and today we're deconstructing the eminence-based world to find out what actually works. Joining us is Helen Pearson, a world-class and award-winning science journalist and editor for the prestigious journal Nature. She has spent the last several years interviewing over 200 experts to write what I consider one of the most important books of the year, Beyond the Belief: How Evidence Shows What Really Works. In this conversation, Helen reveals why highest paid persons' opinions, or hippos, are often the biggest barrier to progress in your workplace. We also discuss why you should never trust a single scientific study in isolation, and how you can use evidence hacks to protect your family from the flood of online misinformation. First, we'll trace the history of evidence-based medicine, from its radical beginnings in the 1990s. Then we'll look at how evidence is being used to fix social policy and management. Finally, Helen will share practical tips on how to teach your children to be critical thinkers in the age of AI. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Hello, Helen, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories.
Delighted to be here, so thank you.
Great book.
Oh, thank you so much.
One of the best books I've read this year, and I do read a book every 2 weeks, and it's definitely one of the better ones. And
please write that on Amazon.
I will. No, I definitely will. Yeah, evidence, it's a great thing, isn't it? Before we talk about that, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your life growing up, and your journey, and how you got into science journalism and writing, please?
Oh, wow, my life. How far do you want to go back? The potted summary.
As far as you want.
Really? Okay, well, I grew up in a small village near Colchester in Essex. And I sort of gradually, gravitated towards science, as I was sort of at school. I pursued science at university, and I considered after that kind of going into science communication after I graduated, but I decided to go on and do a PhD because I figured that even if I did something kind of communicative, then having a PhD certainly wasn't going to help. And I was in the fortunate position of being offered a funded place at the University of Edinburgh. So I went to do that. And I got to the end of that. And I think that was a bit of a fork in the road because, I enjoyed doing it. I was studying like a brain development in mouse embryos. And but I realized maybe I didn't really have the passion I think it really takes to be successful in research. And I love to see the big picture. I like, what I love about what I do now is I get to move between one topic to the next as a science journalist. And so I, from there, went on to, I briefly worked in the Science Museum in London, and then I got an online reporter position at Nature when they were just kind of starting up their online team, and have basically been there ever since doing a variety of roles, but really focused all the time on kind of science journalism, science editing. For a while I kind of ran the whole newsroom, but now I'm really back reporting on science, writing about evidence. There's nothing I like really better than kind of an interesting question. Like at the moment, I'm doing one on is there a crisis of trust in science? And I get to speak to the people around the world who've studied that and hopefully emerge with a story about it.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier on, it's a great book, Beyond Belief: How Evidence Shows What Really Works. And I wasn't sure what to expect from the book when I first read it. But the more I read it, the more I could see how this revolution is taking place. But I suppose what got me about it, first of all, was we start off on medical medicine and health, and probably like many people, I had assumed that, I'm not talking about going back centuries where there was bloodletting and all that sort of thing, but I had assumed that doctors would have prescribed the best course of treatment based on evidence, but that's not the case, is it? Until fairly recently.
Yeah, evidence is a surprisingly new, not invention, but I suppose introduction in medicine. And really, that's one of the main reasons I wanted to write the book. And the book kind of opens with this these stories of these kind of two seminal doctors. One was called Ian Chalmers, who worked in the UK, and one was called David Sackett, who was working over in North America. And they were kind of training in medical school, sort of late 50s, early 60s, and both of them came to this realization that actually they started to question what they were being taught, mostly because they realized that different doctors were handing out different advice for the same condition. So, for example, Ian Chalmers, who's become a kind of, hero of mine, I would say, through reporting this book, he's a really remarkable figure. But he was working in obstetrics and gynecology, and he would notice that, one doctor would say, well, this is a clear case, we did cesarean section, or bed rest is really important in pregnancy. And another doctor would say no such thing. And both of these characters, Chalmers and Sackett, came to realise there was a different way to practice medicine, and that was by drawing on evidence coming out of research. And in particular, they were enamoured by types of studies called randomised controlled trials, which test rigorously, does a drug help people versus a group which doesn't receive the drug. And so both of them, in their ways, went on to kind of pioneer this new way of conducting medicine, which is now called evidence-based medicine. And although the approach was kind of, you could argue it's sort of developing over centuries, and randomized controlled trials were sort of really starting to take off, let's say in the 40s. But this phrase, evidence-based medicine, was only published in the literature, medical literature, around 1991. And then it kind of raced around the world. So like 35 years ago, it's just this really remarkably recent thing. And again, that was kind of one of the I didn't know this when I discovered this. I was like, that's a kind of amazing story. And I think it's really worth reminding ourselves of that now, right? When kind of evidence is under attack, and many people are sort of questioning science, and just to say, well, actually, even the sort of history of this use of evidence is a remarkably recent one.
This evidence-based approach has sort of gone on to become popular for education, social policy, policing, business, which I was in. So that was always an interesting one. And I'll talk about that in a bit of detail, because I've got some amusing anecdotes about that. So some great stuff going on. And I have to say, I think if you read the book, if you're a sort of person who likes to challenge, the status quo, and you have discussions and arguments with people about stuff, politics and things like that, I think the evidence-based side of it is more and more important these days, particularly with all the polarization of arguments now. People take one side or the other without really going into the detail of the evidence and all the rest of it. But there's such a massive information to get that evidence, isn't there? There's thousands of scientific papers that come out. And one of the things that struck me was, I think it was Chalmers who was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Chalmers who said that he wanted it to be that doctors would then look at all the papers that have been assimilated and make a decision about the best form of treatment. And I wonder now whether doctors have actually got the time to read up all about everything that they could possibly get their hands on. How does that work, Helen, now?
It's such a good question, and you're absolutely right. There's an overwhelming amount of research coming out into the world, millions of papers every year. But one of Chalmers' sort of huge innovations was to embrace this approach called evidence synthesis. And that's like a really big theme in the book, and something I've just become really fascinated in by reporting it. But the approach in medicine now is not that you look at one paper at a time or one study at a time, like one randomized trial which has tested, let's say, a drug, but you synthesize all of them together. And the reason for that is that one study alone can be misleading. So it could point in the wrong direction. It could suggest that a drug has an effect when actually perhaps by chance or just the way the study was conducted, in another study might show something else. So it's this intuitive idea that let's bring together all the studies which have tested the drug and look at them together. And Chalmers was a real champion for that approach. And that's now, so this approach of like synthesizing evidence, and scientists use this particular type of study called a systematic review, which sort of, is explained by the name, but you systematically search down all the evidence that can answer your question, you review it, you kick out the bad trials, and hopefully from that you get this kind of clearer signal from the noise. And Chalmers started, you mentioned Cochrane, he started a group called the Cochrane Collaboration, which puts out those types of systematic reviews. And nowadays what happens in medicine is that researchers do these systematic reviews, and systematic reviews are kind of this bedrock of evidence, and from those doctors produce what are called clinical guidelines, and it's that which actually is drawn on by most doctors. So they're not, you're quite right, they haven't got time to go back and read all of the basic literature themselves, but that's also inefficient. So it's almost like it's been done for them. I mean, of course, they will be drawing on and interested in evidence, but these clinical guidelines, which are already built on evidence, is probably what is informing a lot of practice for many doctors.
Moving on to social policy, and I'm going to be quite crude in my précis of what it's about. Basically, what you're saying on the social policy side, and to use one example, in a poverty-stricken region of a country, they were throwing money at the problem, whereas evidence was proved to show that if they targeted that money at the female side of the family, the mother of the family, and accompanied with that money would be a sort of prescription to actually not force but encourage kids to go to school and be educated, it was much more effective than just throwing the money.
Yes, I mean, it's sort of interesting that what's happened is this approach that's been sort of revolutionised medicine of like testing whether things work has now moved across social policy, and it's really taken off in this field of kind of international development economics, which is all about helping families that live in poverty. And one of these early trials, this is what you're talking about, which randomized trials, because initially the sort of people were very resistant to this idea. Like, how can you possibly, assign a complicated like poverty relief program, right? Like it's a pill. Like we're going to randomly give some people this approach, this poverty program, and some people not. It seems too difficult, but it can be done. And this early trial trialed a program called Progressa. This was in Mexico in the 90s. And it was called or known as a conditional cash transfer, which is what you were getting at, so that poor families would be, rather just giving them a handout, or in Mexico they were giving them things like tortillas or subsidies or whatever it might be. It was like, okay, well, we're going to give this family this money, but it comes with conditions, and the conditions are you have to send your kids to school, you have to attend health clinics, get your vaccinations, for example. And it was shown through this kind of very innovative trial, which has become sort of legendary in international development circles, that this indeed did have positive outcomes for the children, who were more likely to attend school and more likely to be sort of, healthier and wealthier decades down the line now, really. And that approach has sort of helped that approach become very popular across dozens of countries nowadays. And then just had this broader impact in like showing that it was possible to sort of do something which was thought impossible, which is actually trial policies and programs in this way.
And we're taking social policy, and I'd like to use that example. Is it a case of, on the example you just mentioned, that then becomes the sort of accepted norm? And is there a danger that further trials to see if the situation can improve perhaps get put to one side and that becomes the accepted norm? How does that work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So one of the things about evidence is that it's always changing, and that you absolutely ought to, as a scientist and a policymaker, be alert to changes in evidence, to new evidence that is coming out. But of course, yeah, you're right. Once policies are set, they can be difficult to change. And one example I had in the book of this was around this early randomized trial that came out. I think it was done in the 80s. Which was done in the US, and it actually randomized people who had committed domestic violence to be arrested or to just be taken away from a crime scene after they had committed domestic violence, and suggested that actually arrest reduced the number of people who went on to commit violence again. And this had quite a kind of big ripple effect around the world, and a lot of police forces changed their policies in order to make arrest the kind of the standard thing to do after a domestic violence incident. But then when later evidence emerged, which actually said, okay, maybe this only works in certain places or amongst certain populations, those policies were difficult to change. I mean, I will say, I think probably the bigger battle is getting evidence incorporated into policy at all, rather than the situation we're talking about, where it was used to create policy. And then, it got overturned. Because, I mean, I talked in the book about this thing called the 80% rule, but most programs and policies haven't really been tested. And I think that's the kind of bigger battle which evidence champions are facing.
One of the things that I was interested with the Cochrane collaboration was how they have to sift through lots and lots of scientific studies and data. And I thought, is there ever a point where perhaps they encourage the people that write these scientific papers to send them directly to them? Is that happening now? Is that something that they've been thinking about?
That's a good question. So yes, that's almost one of the biggest, surprisingly, one of the biggest challenges of like doing a synthesis of evidence or a systematic review, which I was talking about earlier, which sounds really surprising, but you would think it would just be so easy to sort of scan the world's databases and pull together all the relevant studies, but it's difficult, often for just basic reasons like a trial won't be clearly tagged as being a randomized trial. And also some results aren't published in the literature. So sometimes it's a question of literally writing to scientists to ask about their studies. I think the scale of the problem is too big to expect scientists to be writing to inform the systematic reviewers of their study. Although, yes, I agree that there are better ways to do it. And actually, now everybody's going is like, can we use AI to help with this problem in terms of like automatically identifying relevant studies the moment they're published onto the internet?
The sheer number of scientific studies that are done, and if we just take sort of health and medicine as one item, do we know the sort of number of studies that are done per annum? So we can get an idea of that?
It's in the millions. Millions are coming out, and the chart of which sort of shows the number of publications which are coming out per year just looks, it just goes upwards and upwards. So it's a vast amount.
And you mentioned earlier on about some of them are disregarded because of the quality. That must be a very difficult job to sort of decide whether the particular study has been done in a proper and efficient way.
That's right, and. There are a lot of studies coming out, but there are also a lot of studies which aren't necessarily of high quality. And so when researchers are trying to sort of synthesize them together, like I was saying, and kind of say, okay, what does this body of evidence say as a whole? Then they do a step where they'll actually kind of try and screen out the not so good ones, the smaller studies, the sloppy studies. And that's a really important part of the process. And I mean, that's becoming a bigger challenge, I would say, partly because the scientific enterprise itself is expanding, more studies are coming out, and also AI is actually creating a bit of a problem here because, more and more studies are actually, now it's being discovered, kind of, incorporating sort of poor quality AI generated text. So the problem is becoming more difficult.
Yes. Yeah, and I guess AI has the potential to do its own scientific studies.
Well, that's what some AI companies would love us to believe, that maybe we're going to be able to strip humans out of some of these steps altogether. I mean, I would say in, looking at sort of systematic reviewing, which systematic reviews are like the kind of gold standard of making sense of a body of evidence. And I would say in that sense, there is definitely, from the researchers I talk to, you need humans to be involved still. That you can't yet sort of push a button and get this sort of, we can't yet outsource to AI the really important problem of making sense of what the world knows about a question.
Could you just define what a systematic review is?
Yes, absolutely. So let's say we want to know whether statins have a beneficial effect on heart disease. Then a systematic reviewer would go out there and search all the world's kind of academic databases for studies which have tackled that problem. And they might come back initially with maybe tens of thousands, actually, which are potentially relevant. Then they do this it's literally a 20-step process, but they sort of screen out all the duplicate ones. They screen them carefully to get down to the most relevant ones. So you're really whittling them down into the most important ones. And then you've got this smaller group, I don't know, let's say dozens, probably hundreds if it was statins, that are relevant to the question. And then you try and extract the data and you do the statistical analysis to say, okay, what does all this data together, tell us about the effectiveness of this drug? And they also do this step called screening for bias, because some studies, as I mentioned before, just actually, weren't done all that well. And so you kind of want to filter those out as well. So I mean, I wrote it's this process. I mean, it can take years to do, which is one of the problems with these studies. One of them, I think I mentioned in the book, took 8 years, and obviously that's like one of the problems with them is that's just too long. I mean, if you need an answer, sometimes policymakers or doctors need an answer tomorrow. So there's this big push now to try and automate this process and speed it up.
And I guess one good example of something that happened very quickly, and you mentioned it in the book, was the pandemic 6 years ago.
Yes.
With the
So I wrote that kind of put this whole sort of evidence system I wrote about in the book sort of under a huge stress. I mean, of course, we went through it, and we could see how challenging it was for scientists to kind of supply evidence at the speed it was needed, because it was this new virus, and the studies hadn't been done. And what I wrote about partly was there was also this concern. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but the kind of pre-evidence-based medicine days are sometimes called eminence-based medicine, because it was like, let's just do what the most senior doctor in the room says. And there was concern during COVID that, people kind of went back to that. Like, they sort of threw out what they'd learned about evidence-based medicine. We're just like, well, let's just try what's on the shelf, rather than necessarily testing things carefully in trials, although those trials were actually quite quickly done. But it certainly, it stress tested the system. And I think people now are sort of going, okay, how can we improve in the future?
I'd like to move on to business. And it's great how evidence-based management and evidence-based stuff has sort of evolved into business. But there's something which I found quite amusing was the hippo and the zebra. So could you explain what they are, please?
Yes, I might have to check zebra, but hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. So hippo is the eminence-based medicine of management. In that, rather than let's look at what the evidence suggests work in a business or management situation, or another situation, in fact, let's just do what the most senior person in the room says. And the zebra. Oh, I know. The zebra is worse than the hippo, because the zebra is zero evidence but really arrogant, which means they don't care at all. What the evidence says, they're just going to push ahead. Whereas the hippo might be convertible, might be persuaded to look at evidence if it was presented to them. But I loved looking at business and management, but also because I was a manager when I wrote this book, or when I started writing it. And it was just kind of eye-opening to me. I just hadn't really thought, as I think many managers haven't, that there's this vast body of research which actually might point to the most effective ways to run a team. And yet the culture is just not really there, I think, of course, in the way it would be in medicine, that we should draw on that in order to kind of pursue effective practices.
Yes, no, absolutely. And one of the other aspects, I mean, I was involved with it in the company I was with, was we would launch marketing campaigns and spend an awful lot of money doing them and sending the promotional material out. But and I don't think this was peculiar to my company, we very rarely actually sort of analysed what had happened, because we were on to the next big thing. The pressure was then on to do the next thing. And when we did actually start doing some analytical stuff about, well, what did this mean to the overall basket of goods and the profit and all the rest of it, and it was actually really helpful.
It is a kind of classic example, I guess, of not having that maybe scientific mindset into analysing what happens as a result of our actions. Another sort of another thing which is kind of unique, well, maybe not unique, but it is a problem, a barrier to evidence in business and management is just these kind of fads and fashions that waft through, driven by business books. Like, people are far more likely to read, and I mean, I was guilty of this. You read this latest business book about how you ought to be running your team, and you adopt that approach. I mean, in my view, of the fields I looked at, like, that is the field where evidence has almost struggled the most, I think, to gain traction.
You conducted, was it 250 interviews for this book?
It was somewhere between 200 and 250. Yeah. I am aware that the book is kind of championing evidence, but I'm more than aware of all the limitations of evidence. And one of the lessons that comes across from medicine and all these other fields is that evidence, it very rarely, tells you exactly what to do. It's one factor in a decision, and a classic example of this, yes. Let's say in medicine. An antibiotic is absolutely, proven to be effective. The evidence shows it works, but you absolutely have to factor in, the values and the preferences of the person being treated. Let's say that at the end of their life and they don't want any more medical care. Of course, you're not going to give them the antibiotic, regardless of what the evidence says. And that's really the case, across all of these fields in policy as well. It's more like, can the evidence be part of the discussion that we're having?
Do you think the evidence revolution is continuing at pace as it sort of started off in the 90s, really? Do you think it's continuing at pace?
Well, I think it faces, some big problems at the moment, as I think we see around us. On the optimistic side, I mean, I'm reporting a bit on this at the moment, but if you look across the world, like trust in science is quite high. If you look at surveys of who is trusted, like scientists come out quite high, along with doctors and politicians, and journalists like me are kind of down the bottom. But there are clearly problems, right? Because we've got, we've got kind of vocal groups, in the US, Trump and RFK Jr., who are actively kind of, rejecting evidence, choosing to promote things which aren't evidence-based, undermining vaccines. And we've got, just the growth of, just the way we're getting information in terms of, online from different sources, misinformation, is kind of proliferating. So I think that's another problem, is it's making it much harder for sort of evidence to be to sort of rise above the noise, right? It's being drowned out potentially. So I think these are really difficult times actually for evidence, and maybe that's why I hope the kind of book is relevant to remind us that we're on this long, slow kind of path maybe to embracing evidence, and there've always been challenges along the way. I mean, it's interesting that at the beginning, evidence-based medicine was quite sort of radical, like the early proponents of it. Once Ian Chalmers was accused of being a terrorist, the people who were promoting it in the early days were considered to be, upstarts, and because nobody likes being challenged, right? People don't like being told that what they do is not correct. And so evidence has always faced, I think, opposition whenever that approach has been introduced.
I'm wondering what it's like for and how important it is for our children in schools to understand a bit like the old classic days of rhetoric. I know you talk about education, the best ways to educate, but actually the children themselves, so they can discern some of this stuff.
Yeah, I did. I completely agree with you. I think, sort of teaching or helping children be able to kind of, wade through the misinformation, right, and spot false claims is arguably one of the most important skills we need to give children at the moment, given the kind of online world that they are living in. And there are some really interesting efforts to do that. And I wrote about one in the book where some researchers have developed this kind of a sort of textbook and a way to help children recognise false health claims. So, when we're sold like miracle cures online, and it just gives them these kind of basic kind of questions to ask of just like, well, okay, has this been through a test? Like if these people are claiming that, 50% of people got better with their new, magic pill. Well, okay, is there another group that maybe 50% of people got better anyway? So it sort of helps them understand some sort of basic questions that they can be asking. And they actually went out and tested this training. It was basically critical thinking training. They tested it in a randomized trial and showed that the children indeed were better at spotting false claims afterwards. And there's quite a big move now to kind of to sort of roll that out into schools. But there's lots of other examples. I think this is a really important question at the moment, right, of how to encourage critical thinking in children, given the online world they're in, and given AI as well. So I,
yes.
I don't have all the answers, but a lot of people are talking about it.
Are you going for a particular type of reader for this book, academics, and what would you like them to take away?
I'd like it to go well beyond academics, because I think, I speak to a lot of academics, and those who are in that world kind of, they know about evidence-based medicine, or these phrases themselves are a bit alienating, evidence-based policy or whatever. And I wanted to, so the book is published as a trade book. I've tried to write it for a kind of informed, maybe science-interested audience. I don't think I'm probably going to convert, conspiracy theorists to thinking about evidence, but, I just want to open people's eyes maybe to this. And it's a fascinating story with all these interesting people in. But I also ultimately want to empower people to think about evidence. So I certainly emerged from reporting on it just feeling more empowered to look for evidence, even if it's just and I put a bunch of evidence hacks at the end of the book to help people do that.
Yes, I enjoyed that.
So even if it's just going, okay, here's a claim I found online, you can is there evidence behind it? So the most basic thing we can do is to be skeptical and go, okay, is there some evidence? Is there some research? If there is, has it been peer reviewed, meaning like scrutinized by scientists and published in a scientific journal? That's an imperfect filter, but it's a basic thing we can ask. And maybe if you're looking for evidence, look for like a systematic review or some type of overview of the evidence rather than thinking that just that one study is the answer.
The reason I asked about the target reader is I found it a very interesting story with all the different characters. And I just felt that it's a book that anybody can read and thoroughly enjoy.
Good. I'm delighted to hear you say that, because I think evidence can sound a bit sort of abstract or inaccessible. And I wanted to show that really the whole of the evidence revolution is just people who have sort of had this light bulb go off in their heads where they're like, most of the practices in my field, like in medicine, are basically conventional wisdom, hippos, zebras. But there's a different way to do things. And I think reading their stories of how they challenged the norm is hopefully sort of gets across this idea perhaps better than just writing about it in the abstract.
It's been a really interesting discussion. Helen, I would thoroughly recommend the book to anybody who wants a good read, lots of characters to hear about, and how this story has sort of evolved particularly over the last 30 years and where it's going. And I think the last part of the book where you give people practical tips in terms of, challenging statements and claims, I think is really useful. My guest today has been Helen Pearson. Helen is an award-winning science journalist and editor of Nature. And you can find details of Helen's book, Beyond Belief, How Evidence Shows What Really Works, in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Helen.
Thank you so much for having me and for your great questions.